I'm going to leave you over in his capable hands. Basically, we both work for a company called 1337. We are computer technology consultants, and we really like to share knowledge with our clients, with our community, and with all of our employees. So I'm going to let Tobias take it away. He's going to run over his presentation, and then basically it's open and we can go forward and have a really interesting discussion. So don't be shy with sending over questions or just asking questions, because that's really where the magic's going to happen. Right, Tobias?
That is correct. And as per normal, I won't see you during the presentation, so just like throw something in the chat and we can talk about it afterwards. I think that's the easiest way in that kind of setup. Let me just share my screen and then we're right on the way. Cool. If everything worked, you should see a blue slide that says 1337, and that's exactly correct. Thanks so much for joining for your lunch break. I'm sure you could have aimlessly scrolled through Facebook as well, or whatever you do during lunch, but I'm super happy you chose not to and instead join us for this little talk about accessibility. If you're here today, there's a good chance you're here because of this elephant that's in the room, and has a lot of different names. You might have heard of EN 301-549, the European Accessibility Norm. You might also have heard about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and last but not least, the EAA, the European Accessibility Act. And those are a lot of names, and they can be a bit scary at first, but really all those boil down to one thing, and that is accessibility. And today I want to talk about accessibility and is this actually a necessity or is it just a legal requirement? Before we dive in, a couple of words on talking about accessibility and dealing with accessibility. Unfortunately, I've a lot of times experienced that accessibility can be a bit of a touchy topic. And why is that? There's this kind of implied feeling of pressure to speak politically correctly about accessibility. It's about those other people that we don't really know who they are. There are many terms and there's technical jargon. It's really easy to get afraid to make mistakes. And unfortunately, the result of all of that then is that many companies, organizations, and people just choose to rather not talk about accessibility at all. And that's really the worst thing we can do. So let's build some vocabulary together to not fall into that trap. What is disability? Disability is a reduction in physical, psychological, or intellectual functional ability. Not more, not less than that. It's actually pretty simple and straightforward. And what does that mean? How can that be a problem? If we start out looking at an individual and the abilities the person has, being able to talk or to see or to hear or to walk or to think, and whatever that individual's ability is, that's just totally fine. On the other side, we have the demands of the outside world. And as long as those two skills, or those two are on the same level, there is no problem. But what happens if the outside world has higher demands on an individual than what an individual is capable of doing? That's where we introduce barriers. And that barrier means that certain parts of our society, and specifically now we're talking about digital accessibility, so the digital services and products that we have cannot move around freely in that realm. And that's a problem. And especially when it comes to digital products and services, it's also totally unnecessary. So our job as makers of services and products really is to make sure there's either ideally no barrier at all, or keep it at least as low as possible so that everybody, no matter what their specific abilities are, can go over slower bumps in the road and be part of the digital life we all rely on today. But unfortunately, a lot of people I've talked to through the years and companies oftentimes respond with something like, "Oh, but we don't need to think about accessibility because our audience is not," and then you just make up some sort of problem, blind, or I don't think deaf people shop here, and that's, I mean, plain wrong. But also it's a very simplified truth, because really disabilities vary greatly. And Microsoft has done a fantastic job a couple of years ago listing disabilities and how we see them. And if you look in the first column, we have the permanent ones that we, I think, oftentimes think about, but there are other situations where those can happen. So if you look at like those sensations like touch, see, hear, speak, if somebody is deaf, it's permanent and it's quite simple. Somebody doesn't hear, fine. But what happens if it's temporary? What happens if somebody who normally has good hearing but has an ear infection and suddenly is not able to take audible clues from a system or listen to the news or those kind of things? Or even further, if the person really is healthy and has good hearing, but works in a noisy environment. Everywhere there, assistive technologies and good accessibility is really important and can help us over the bump. And we can go even further. What happens if the person has an accent? Maybe some of you would love some subtitles for me today because English is not my native language. So it's very much a plethora of different situations that can result in our need to have help accessing digital systems. Let's have a look at what it can look like or what it can feel like to a person when they can't get to what they need to get to. And now it's actually going to be interesting if the audio is going to work or not. So if you can't see well or not at all, then it's really helpful if you can listen to a website. I brought in a little example here, and for those of you who have never done this before, in the upper left corner you'll see a little black square. And while I play the video, you'll see how that square moves along through the website and stops at every button or link. And while that happens, a screen reader will read out what's sort of the information for somebody who can't necessarily see it. Please do tell me in case you can't hear the sound, because then I'm going to have to switch the audio settings. But we'll try it out.
Button. You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control, Option, Space. Visited, link, image. https://www.zingtongrap.com/ Visited, link. No, you are currently on a link. Tick button. You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control.
So I hope you just heard that. But even if you heard it, there's not a lot you can understand, because what does a button know? And here's where somebody who relies on those audible cues totally gets lost. But with less than 2 lines of code, we can actually turn the situation around and do something more like this.
Visited, link, image. Company logo, Zington Faradetta Claremont. Visited, link. Change language to Norwegian.
Now that is much more helpful, isn't it? So, as I said before, things are not always black and white either. So, none of us is getting any younger, unfortunately. So at some point we need glasses. And that also means that we need information to be bigger on the screen. So one of the requirements for accessibility, according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is that you're able to zoom in to a page without the page breaking, so that you can see what you need to see. So if we look at an example that many of you in Sweden will know, it's a pretty busy site as it is. But what happens if we do have to zoom in to make the text legible and bigger? Then this happens. And between the cookie banner down there and this menu, there's really not a lot to see of the content. And this is where an experience breaks and the site becomes inaccessible to users who rely on this kind of feature. And most likely, you don't envision those people using your product. But this is a picture I took a couple of weeks ago on my commute to work. And this man had to use a magnifying glass to be actually able to use their telephone. And this is really ironic because he should be able to use the tools that are in the phone to not have to carry around his own accessibility aid with him. But unfortunately, that's not always the case, or most of the time it's not the case. And still, we go back to companies and organizations and people saying, oh, but we don't need to think about accessibility because our target group is not. And this is where really, I'm sorry, but shit hits the fan, because what if your target audience is, for example, Black?
Nice. Okay, Noel, you try now. I'm to your hand. Too black?
Too black.
Yeah.
So what I'll
Come
do...
again. Come again, Sashi.
No.
You too back over way.
What I have to do to get
what you have to do?
This is how racialist thing is.
Yeah.
I have to use that piece of white. Let's say a napkin and a shoulder again. What's the difference?
Pay up again.
Napkin again.
Right, put your hand out.
What's it called in a hand?
Man, the black man getting fight all over.
So I'm pretty sure we all agree you really don't want to be this company. Because when I talked earlier about barriers and gaps, here somebody created a gap for somebody who would not, a barrier who would not actually experience one with a regular button. But here is a good example of technology excluding somebody who we probably would, no, not probably, who is just able-bodied. And just think about all those other occurrences in our daily lives where those kind of things happen, and we should really make sure that they don't. So you don't want to be this company. First of all, it's wrong. Second of all, it's also pricey. An example from SIS already from 2018, so even before we started talking about European accessibility laws, they were fined 1.9 million Swedish crowns by the US Department of Transportation because their website, their main website, was not accessible. And it's one thing to pay a fine, but also the PR that comes with it. You really don't want to have any part of that. And when people ask me, but Tobias, really, I mean, how many people have those kind of problems? That's typically a number that's very hard to estimate because, again, it can also be a very sensitive topic. But if you just look at Statistics Sweden, if we look at the population at an age 17 to 65 in Sweden, 36% of that age group have at least one disability. And that means, you know, you could be wearing glasses or have a hearing aid, but you could also have several of those problems together. If we go a little further to the age bracket 65 plus, that is 50%. 50% of the age bracket 65 plus have at least one disability. And we're living in an aging society, which means this number only has one trend, and that is up. And if you're like me and worked with that question a while, I just can't turn this off. And I just, please go to a restaurant, you know, one of those fancy ones that has dimmed lights, and then look around you and look at like this elderly couple that has to get out their phone to have a flashlight to actually be able to read the menu. This is the things we keep talking about. So if you're losing somewhere between 30 and 50% of your possible client base online, then that is a problem. And that's not only an ethical problem, it's a business problem. So here we're talking about scalability and market share just as much as we talk about ethical questions. And keep in mind, why we who create digital services and products really love to think that the people who use just our products are young, able-bodied, highly educated, and technically interested. The reality probably looks more like this. And those people really need to help if we want to have, not the least, their business and their money. But it's not only doom and gloom. There are ways to make things better. So let's tackle that. How can we do this? Let's come back to the elephant in the room. The European Accessibility Act was actually already signed into law in 2019. So there's been quite a bit of time that has passed. But there was a long grace period. So only next year, the 25th of June 2025, will the European Accessibility Act go into effect. It will apply to consumer-facing products and services made by companies with 10 or more staff and 2 million euros in turnover or more. If a product is not compliant, you can be fined up to 20,000 euros per violation. So if you have, as a company, several storefronts or several services, and each of them is not compliant, you pay for each of those. If you feel like, well, no, 20,000 is money, but not enough, if you don't fix the problems, you can get daily penalties up to 1,000 euros per day, per instance. And if that's not enough, then you might, in an extreme case, even be forced to shut down your product and business altogether. And I know of some European countries where actually the local legislation states that if you're the CEO of a company or responsible for those, you even can go to jail up to 18 months. So let's not get to that. That would be really sad. How do we do this? What's the road to accessible products and services look like? If you're here right now and you feel like, oh, this makes me really uncomfortable because I don't know what's happening, the first thing is learn what are you actually up to within your company, within your products. Identify the gaps between the legal requirements and what you have today, but also see what competence actually do you already have in-house. My experience is that a lot of people who create digital services and products cared about accessibility, but for many years have not gotten the support of their organizations. And now with the legislation incoming, there's a really good argument to bump accessibility up on the prioritization list. Once you've done that, create a roadmap how to tackle those problems. How can you address those issues? What needs to be fixed? But also, who's responsible for what area of expertise? Because a lot of people think accessibility problems are equal to technical problems, and that's wrong. Yes, there's a big chunk that is technical, but think about a newspaper. Your site can be as accessible as you want. If your editorial staff writes in a complicated way so that it's cognitively not very accessible, you still have a problem. Or if you don't know how to name and write links properly, then you're not accessible either. So it's not just technical, it's for a whole organization. Implement those improvements. And again, there is a big chunk that is technical, but also it might not only be your systems that you need to update or buy a new one, but also look at the processes. What kind of quality standards and quality assurance do we actually have in our work process? Do we need to fix them? Do we need to improve them? Educate your organization. Really make sure that everybody understands the requirements and the principles for creating accessible digital products. And also look at areas where you might not suspect that somebody needs that kind of skill set, but of course they probably do anyways. And then last but not least, maintenance and monitoring. Follow up regularly, do audits, but also our technical means change. For example, in the European Accessibility Act right now, it states that you need to have subtitles for video. But at the same time, certain live streams are not forced to have subtitles because at the time of writing, we didn't have all this fancy AI stuff and we couldn't necessarily pull this off. But now we can. So just because the legislation says one thing, it doesn't mean you have to stop. You can go ahead and make your products better at the same pace as technology improves and our knowledge improves. Because in the end, working with accessibility is very much like brushing your teeth. You would not just brush your teeth on Mondays and maybe Sundays, because that's not enough. In order for it to be effective, you must really make it a habit. And that's the same thing with a lot of things we do, and accessibility is definitely one of those. So if you think this is interesting to you, or it is relevant, we put together a collection of resources for you on our website. So you can go back in. We have more webinars, we have articles, we have also linked resources. And of course, ask me questions once I start babbling here. Also, if this is your thing and you're in Stockholm, we will be at the Dagens Industri event conference Bank Tech on the 14th of November. We will both be talking more about accessibility, but also we will bring a little test it yourself setup where you can go in and experience some of the things I talked about today firsthand and get a feeling for what it feels like to not be able to access the system and the page that you need to get your work done. So much for me. Thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing the screen, and I hope there are a couple of questions that I can ideally answer.
Thank you, Tobias. So straight off the bat, I mean, note to self, add subtitles to next webinar. I think we can learn from. Is there any questions right now that anyone has, or any comments or anything that they want to take with Tobias? Don't be shy. He won't hurt. Oh, burn. See, I actually have a question here because, like, it seems like a really overwhelming area when you put it out like that. You know that there are all these different types of disabilities that come into play. In all the things I've been reading about, this sort of want for people to understand if there's some kind of checklist that that you can be looking through to see it. But I mean, surely this is bigger than just a checklist. So how do you keep on top of this in this sort of ever-changing landscape?
Yeah, it's a super good question because I've seen so many accessibility checklists in my work life, and oftentimes it happens that somebody goes to a conference or a workshop about accessibility and then brings back that checklist and like, now we solved all of our problems, and that checklist gets then given to every person in the company, and that goes into a drawer and then never looked at again. And this is unfortunately not how it works because it's still that's overwhelming. I'm trying to stress that starting is just so important. Getting started, you won't fix everything at once, but you need to make one step and then make sure you got that covered, and also in the future got that covered. Not just fix it once, but also fix it for everything you build the next time around, and then tackle the other thing. And there's this principle of like learning. So as a child, you start out not knowing that you're not able to drive a car. And then at some point you realize, oh, there are cars and I could drive them, but I can't. And then you go to driving school and you learn how to drive a car and you really focus and your t-shirt's sweaty because that's like, it takes your whole attention. And then at some point you can just drive a car and you just can start, talking on the phone or talking to somebody else. And it still works. It's just a habit that has come in. And accessibility works in a very similar way. You need to go through those steps. And maybe today we can talk about those first ones. You're not knowing that something's lacking, and also realizing, oh, there is something that I should learn. And then there are those two next steps. And when your organization really matures in the field of accessibility, then it will just be a normal part of it, of your quality process and of your development process in general.
I'm just thinking, like, how do you know if you don't know? Like, how can you get started with it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there are tons of resources out there, and lots of them are really good. A lot of people try to help understand. So, for example, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines better. There there are forums you can talk to, but also, I mean, get help. Know somebody. I mean, we're obviously talking about this right now. I know there are many people out there talking about it. Pick up the conversation. Going back to that first slide, don't be shy about it. It's really important that we talk about it, because stigma around the topic does not help us at all. But talking and sharing experience is. And even if you read all those guidelines cover to cover, you will always end up in situations where you're not entirely sure, or you need somebody who's done that before. And then it's important to ask for help. If you're in an organization where you haven't talked about this at all and really think, ugh, we had so many other plans for our roadmap and now this happens, get somebody to help. Talk to us. We're happy to sort of point you in the right direction or help you with the things we can do. Just get started.
I think that applies to quite a lot of things, right? Is we set up our own mental barriers because it's all just too much, and you just need to take that first step. Crazy. My mind's going all over the place. Miha, please jump in.
Hi, it's Miha from Ljubljana. I have been an advocate for digital accessibility for a long time, but on the other hand, you have these national authorities, or whatever they are called, who are going to check if your products are accessible. And let's say you have a big website with, I don't know, 1,000 pages, or you are a news website which has, I don't know, 100,000 pages. You have an archive. And, you can't really make everything 100% accessible via all the guidelines. My question here is how to be sensible if you're in a hurry to fix up big website in a year. Because these national authorities, I don't think they're also trained so well. I don't want to, propose that you don't do accessibility, but let's be realistic, because everybody can find something wrong, something against the guidelines. Thank you.
Oh, great. It's a great question. And again, because there are so many guides and they're so long and there are so many different aspects, you can really get the feeling that everything needs to be perfect or we don't have to do this at all. And I think that's really not what we should be doing. If you have done this for a while, you obviously know a couple of things, like making it work for a screen reader, so the screen reader doesn't get lost on the screen. It is a good important one. Making sure that you can navigate a website without a mouse, like with a keyboard, for example, is really good and a good first step. Looking at the color contrast, it's like, yeah, it's super chic to have light gray and dark gray, but it's also totally impossible to read. So you can start doing things, and we all know it's a process. And while you are expected to be compliant at some point, I think that's not what I would focus on. I would really take that perspective. I want as many people as possible to be able to use what I'm making. And that's a process again, and it will not always be perfect either. But I think starting it and being able to show that you have an idea, even if you don't reach all the way where you are yet, you should have an idea how you get there, or how would you be able to mitigate that. And that will probably get you very far. And going back to the good old Pareto principle, if you get 80%, that's oftentimes pretty quick already. Then don't sweat the last 20. Sure, you should try everything you want to do, but it's like a base hygiene is, I think, what many organizations and companies need to deal with at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? Wonderings? Get a hold of Tobias while you can. He's not going anywhere. It was just, you might want to pop off and have some lunch at some stage.
So you might have noticed that I gave you examples. The focus is on digital accessibility, but I gave you examples also from the physical world, and I think that's really interesting, because I think I get the question a couple of days ago, why do we actually make a difference between digital accessibility and accessibility, physical accessibility? And there's sort of two different fields, but the underlying principle of not excluding people because of their abilities is totally the same. Also, while you definitely can see problems in digital tools and services and products, once you start thinking about it and just, go now, if you have a couple of minutes left, go take a walk and just look around you and see where things are not as good as they could be. And once you start that mindset, I talked about the restaurant earlier, and I can't unsee it. And so you discover all those different things where you start wondering, but why? I'm a lefty, and I'm a very proud lefty. Whenever I see a ladle that has a spout on only one side that only works for a right-handed person and does not have a spout on the other side, I just wonder why. At least make two so that you can pour the sauce from both sides. But just putting one in there is just, doesn't make any difference. And I get upset because this is what I would like us to avoid.
More sauce for the people.
Yes.
That's
but
what I'm taking.
But it's the least thing we can do is not put barriers where there's sort of no need for it or where it's super easy to avoid them. Then there are more ambitious aspects where we may have to think a bit more. Then there are also exceptions. So the law states that if accessibility requirements would alter the character of your product significantly, then you might not have to comply with everything. But what I don't want us to do is go, oh, let's try to find the loopholes here, because again, that's the wrong thing to do. But just don't be scared. I think being afraid is not a good driver. It gets you in motion, but then actually enthusiasm will get you way more and way longer.
I mean, it seems like the biggest thing you can do is start the conversation within the organization. It's like Miha said, there's some of these great big companies that they've got all these different problems and they perhaps don't even know where to start. And then there's smaller organizations that have got perhaps the same kinds of issues, but like for them on a smaller scale. But it's just all about taking that first step, starting that conversation and making sure that you're moving towards where you need to be moving.
It totally is. And there's a story I like to tell. I've talked to a company within the music industry, and they just built this fantastic new website and are super proud. And I asked them, so accessibility, how do you work with that? And as an answer, I got, oh, we use one of those automatic testing tools, and I just hear we get over 90%. And then I thought, that sounds too good to be true, and I tested it myself, and it turned out it's very broken, because those tools will maybe catch 20 or 30%, and it's good to use those tools, but you can't rely on it purely. So what you really don't want to do is have this false sense of security or safety that, oh, everything is fine, and then in May you realize, oops. Because dealing with accessibility can also always go like different ways. You might be in a position where you do an analysis or review and you go like, yeah, we've got things to do, but we can fix it. But there are also chances that you build your systems on technologies that just won't let you do it. I have heard rumors that Java is pretty sticky to work with that. And then what does happen if you have to buy a new tool, or if you have to rebuild something because fixing it would be more expensive than building it up again? But then you don't want to do this in the 11th hour. You want to know this now so that you can plan this and budget for it, and then be confident that you can make the deadline and into the future as well.
And I think as well, I mean, as with anything, any kind of digital product, it's never done, right? So the work on accessibility is going to just continue to be something that needs attention going forward.
It totally does. And I mean, there's so many things we could talk about today. There's, for example, also developer experience. I've met a lot of developers who are super eager to embrace accessibility and the technologies behind it, and some who don't and feel it's scary or whatever. But we have a lot of good tools and good frameworks on the web, at least, that will help you. And the just the way you have a code linter today that tells you if your code is in good style or not. You've got linters for accessibility as well, and it will tell you off if you're missing a accessibility attribute in your code or those kind of things. And I've seen developers who were not super happy having to deal with this, and when I showed them that they're basically tests, like, look, now your accessibility test is red, and now when you fix it, it turns green, and suddenly they were super excited, and it developed this pride of my tests are passing. It's like, that can be really cool and really empowering. And there's technology is also changing and supporting it more and making it more of a really non-question. It's just there, and we make use of it.
Fantastic. Are there any more questions to send to Tobias, or does everyone just want to go and grab some lunch and go and have a walk around and see everything that's completely non-accessible in their vicinity? I can see lots of notes being handed into the likes of HR going forward. Everyone's going to run and test their soap dispensers.
Please, by the way, so if you find those kind of things, I'm just a real sucker for those examples, because of course you can Google a lot of those. But if you find them yourself, like the picture from the train, it's a bit of a different story. And suddenly you're like, oh, really? So if you find any of those, please do send them to me. I guess my contact information will be somewhere there. I'd love to hear from you and tell me your stories. I'd really appreciate that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today, Tobias. I for one have learned a lot. Thank you to all of you for joining us. This has been recorded, so we will make sure that as soon as Google lets us, it will be sent out to you so that you can watch it again, or perhaps share it with someone that might find this interesting. And as Tobias says, if you do have any questions, then please do get in touch. And apart from that, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of the day. Oh, no,
there was a
I thought it
raised
was.
hand.
It was a hand raise like this. One of those. All right, then. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.